So if you've been floating around the creative corners of the internet for any length of time, you've probably heard some variation of the saying niche down to grow or something equally annoying. But how true is that? Do filmmakers really need to be specialists, or is there still room for generalists in 2024? Can you thrive as a jack of all trades as a filmmaker, or are you hurting yourself by offering everything? This is a question that I've been asking myself on and off for the last 15 years or so of working professionally with cameras, and in this video we're going to get into whether or not having a niche helps or hurts you, and whether or not I'd niche down if I were starting again in 2024. First off, what even is a niche or niche or however you want to pronounce it? Well, basically it just refers to what kind of work people most associate you with. It's that one sentence bio on the page of your website that says Luke Forsyth is a blank who does blank, and while that sounds simple enough, if you've ever tried to write one of those lines for yourself, you probably know that it's anything but easy. Mine is super short and it says something like Luke Forsyth is a director and cinematographer specializing in cinematic documentary storytelling. But it's taken me years of tinkering to get it even to that point. But does this even matter? I mean, I personally work on a lot of different stuff, from big commercials to narrative shorts sometimes, and maybe even the odd music video, so why would I limit myself and say that I'm a documentary specialist instead of just a filmmaker or videographer or anything else the client might need for that matter? Well, let's just flip the perspective for a second and imagine that we're a producer or a brand manager or maybe a production company looking to hire someone for our next project, which we can just say is a sports documentary for a random example. And I'm going to assume for the sake of this video that you're actually looking for paid work here, because none of this really applies to you if all you want is to make your own projects and then distribute them for free. If that's you, then you're the freest kind of filmmaker in the whole world and you can essentially do whatever you want. But if you want to get hired / paid one day, then the question's a little bit more complicated. Okay, so let's imagine that in their search for the perfect freelancer for their project, our fictional clients are trying to decide between two filmmakers, this goat and this cat. Both of them have great websites, nicely curated Instagram feeds, they've both been shooting for the same amount of time more or less, and they both own the identical gear packages. So basically the same level of experience and ability. The only difference is how they present themselves. Now, the cat's website shows an impressive variety of work, from weddings to branded content spots and maybe a short doc and a trailer for a narrative indie film. The About section on their website says, "Hi, I'm Kat, I'm an independent filmmaker and videographer, and I can shoot anything you need because I've done it all." Then they open up the goat's website and compare. At first, it doesn't look like the goat has anywhere near the same depth of experience as the cat, because all their work samples are just focused on stories about athletes. Their bio doesn't mention anything about having worked on narrative projects or music videos or anything else really. It's all just about sports and athletes. Now, if you compare to the cat, the goat looks a little one-dimensional, no? But if you were the client making a sports doc, which of these two would you hire? For me, it's the goat all day. If I'm making a story about sports and I had to choose between someone who specializes in what I need and an all-purpose videographer, it's an easy choice. It's not just filmmaking either, because if I were looking for, I don't know, a wedding cake, I would probably be more likely to hire a baker who specializes in wedding cakes over one who does a little bit of everything. That's not to say that the guy who makes sourdough all day couldn't do it, but which one would you feel more confident in as you plan for your wedding? Now, declaring yourself as a sports documentary specialist is a pretty narrow niche, so I'm not saying you need to be that specific, because I'm definitely not that specific. But I do think that it's relevant as an example for all filmmakers who want to attract clients. When you advertise yourself as a generalist, you're sort of stunting your growth, because usually the only people who hire generalists are at the lower end of the job spectrum. These are the clients who just need someone who's good with cameras and might not care all that much about the really refined details. And that's all well and good for a while, but when you want to start growing in your field, you're going to have a hard time standing out compared to the specialists. Like, why was Greg Fraser chosen as the DP for Dune? Was it because he'd done a bunch of rom-coms, or was it because he'd done a lot of massive sci-fi epics in the past? I mean, I know he can do a lot more than just sci-fi. He'd probably make anything look amazing, but a director like Denis Villeneuve is probably not going to trust their $190 million movie to the rom-com guy. So what does does all this mean for you? Well, you can probably already guess that I'm pushing for specialization over generalizing, but it's not quite as simple as that. For one, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what niching down means for your career, because choosing to market myself to a very specific segment of the market has actually given me a lot more opportunities, not fewer. But I'll explain that in a bit. But I also want to take the pressure off some of you who are a little bit earlier on in your careers and might be thinking that you need to know your niche immediately, because a true niche is something you have to grow into over time, not just necessarily something you start out with on day one. So let's unpack that for a second. When you're just starting out, you really do need to shoot a little bit of everything to figure out what you like and what you don't like. When I first started getting really interested in cameras as a photographer, I started by shooting like classic travel photos of beaches and sunsets and all that stuff. Then over time, I started getting into grittier street photography, and then eventually into more documentary style stuff in photojournalism. So later, when I moved into video, I already knew what I wanted to focus on, and I started advertising myself as a documentary cinematographer from day one. So even though it looked like I had a niche right out of the gate, the reality is it took nearly 7 years for me to find it properly. And if somewhere along the way I found that I actually like portraiture or food photography or whatever more than documentary, I'd have given myself the freedom to go off in that direction instead. Now, with all that said, I think the faster you can start to niche down, the more success you'll have. But maybe you're asking, how did I even know what direction to start moving in? And maybe more importantly, how can you figure out what a good niche for yourself might be? Well, really the best way is to just follow your instincts and think about where your interests and your abilities overlap. Like, it's all well and good to be interested in extreme sports and want to go off and make the next free solo, but that's not going to work if you're not also an elite climber. Likewise, let's say you've got skills that don't line up with your interests, like let's say you're a tennis champion but you have no interest in making sports films. It's going to feel like a slog and you'll get sick of forcing it and then probably quit. A sustainable niche has to strike a balance between these two forces. Like for me, it's a combination of my interests and my unique experiences that make me particularly well suited to documentary work. I studied literature and history in school, and I've always loved reading nonfiction, so I was definitely interested in telling real stories. On top of that, I'd been traveling pretty heavily for 4 or 5 years before I started shooting, and that included sailing across the Indian Ocean and teaching English in Korea for a couple of years and working on farms in Australia and New Zealand for a couple of years. So I knew I actually liked being immersed in other cultures and unfamiliar environments, because it's really easy to romanticize what it's like to fly halfway around the world to document something, but do you actually like being away from home and on the road for weeks at a time? Not everyone does. And really my niche goes even deeper than just international documentaries, because if you look at how I market myself, it veers towards the more intense side of things, like really remote environments and even some conflict zones. But again, that's not just because I like the idea of that stuff. I'm actually pretty well suited to living rough because of the 5 seasons I spent as a professional tree planter in northern Canada. I lived in a tent for months at a time, and I worked in clear cuts for 10 hours a day. It was a pretty brutal job. I'm not saying I'm some super tough guy, but I am pretty content with standing in the rain all day or carrying super heavy bags up muddy hillsides in a way that not everyone else is. I like that kind of thing, and I'm pretty good at it if I do say so myself. Now, my experience won't be the same as yours, and the overlap in my Venn diagram is also probably going to be pretty different than yours. So if you're trying to find your own niche, just be patient. Set aside some time to think about it or go for a walk. Don't think you need to pick the perfect thing either, but finding out where your interests and abilities overlap will give you at least a general target to aim for, and then you can refine it from there over time. But the sooner you start to head in an intentional direction, the better, in my opinion. And here's why. We all know the fastest way from point A to point B is in a straight line, and the same thing is true in creative careers like filmmaking. I'm not saying there's no room for creativity or spontaneity or that you can't experiment along the way, but it's undeniable that the more time you spend heading towards a specific goal, the faster you'll get there. Filmmaking careers take time, a lot of time, but the growth tends to be slowest at the beginning stages of the journey, and then it compounds faster and faster once you get some momentum. You don't just creep along steadily. You struggle really hard to get your foot in the door, and then you finally get that one job that leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to 2 more. And then in a quarter of the time it took you to book that first gig, you suddenly find you have enough work coming in to quit your day job and go full time. And that means the sooner you can start on your path, the sooner you're going to get out of that horrible grinding phase and start seeing rewards. I've had to start over multiple times, like when I jumped from stills to video. Let me get rid of these guys. Like when I moved from stills to video, and every time I moved locations, like from Cambodia to Mexico, and then again from Mexico back to Canada. In each place, despite having more and more experience, there's this painful rebuilding process of finding new contacts, meeting new people, and expanding my network until work starts coming my way again. If I hadn't moved, like let's say I'd never left Cambodia all those years ago, odds are I'd be right at the top of the pile for any incoming work, and getting off that direct path by moving definitely set me back a little every time. The same is probably true for you. The more you can stick to one thing and apply effort in a consistent direction, the faster that momentum's going to compound. So by all means, move if it feels right, try new things, experiment, and see what works. But the quicker you are to find something to aim for, the faster it's going to work. But maybe you're wondering, doesn't being associated with something only within a specific niche, like let's say verite cinematography for me, doesn't that mean you miss out on some cool opportunities in other areas? Well, yeah, sort of, but also very much no. It is true that based on my portfolio, it's pretty unlikely that Apple is going to hire me for the next iPhone commercial, and I don't think I'd be a good fit to try and figure out all the technical details of shooting Dune 3. But styles and genres are more fluid than it sometimes seems, and if you get really good at something, it's amazing how often those skills can be applied to other areas. Like Renan Ozturk spent most of his career shooting mountain sports, but that hasn't stopped him from also shooting campaigns for Sony and Dodge Ram trucks. But those brands aren't coming to him because he calls himself a commercial director or an overall photographer. It's because they want him to bring his brand of ruggedness to their products. And I've found that that happens a lot more than you might think. Like for a personal example, about 4 years ago, I got hired by one of the biggest social media companies in the world, who I'm not allowed to name contractually, but if you think of the top 3, it's one of those. Normally, I'd be a pretty unlikely hire for a commercial like that, but for that particular campaign, they wanted to tell real stories about users who'd applied their app to grow their businesses in rural areas, and so they didn't want shiny, polished commercials. In fact, they specifically wanted people who'd shot for the New York Times before, and so I actually got the job based on my doc experience over the people with big-time agents in LA. And that's true again and again in the industry. You don't want to try and make yourself appealing to everyone at once. You're much better off getting known for your particular style and then getting so good at it that when people want something in that kind of style, you're the first person they think of. So all that is to say that yes, if you change the copy on your website to say you're a specialist in, say, documentaries like I do, you'll probably lose out on some things in the beginning. But that's more true at the low end of the spectrum. And if you know what you want and you stick with it and rise to the top of that niche, then I think you're going to find that the big opportunities are still wide open. Like maybe that local business isn't going to hire you for their corporate training video anymore, but flash forwards a few years to when you get really known for something, and you might just find yourself getting offers you never even thought about. Like Renan didn't book those truck ads because he promoted himself as this all-round image maker. He got it because he was the best at what he did, and that's what Dodge liked. So basically what my experience has shown me is that generalists might do okay at the beginning, but specialists go a lot further in the long run. So try things, experiment, and see what you like, especially when you're starting out. But as you start to get a clearer picture of where you want to take your career and where your interests and abilities are converging, then lean into it and go hard. See ya.